This is Ruthven Barracks. In 1746, after defeat at the Battle of Culloden, Jacobite forces gathered here to regroup and start again. They sent a letter to Bonnie Prince Charlie, whose reply came, "Every man for himself." The Jacobite cause was lost, but we now know that it wasn't just the Jacobite cause that came to an end that day, but a whole way of life. Was defeat inevitable? Could the Jacobites have won at Culloden? And if they had, how would things have been different? If you're interested in the people, places and events in Scottish history, then click the subscribe button at the bottom right of the screen and ring the notification bell to be told when I upload new videos. In the meantime, let me introduce you to some experts. I recently went to the Salutation Hotel in Perth, Bonnie Prince Charlie's administrative base on his way south, and I was given access to the room where he worked to meet with two expert historians and all-round good blokes to ask the question, what if the Jacobites had won at Culloden? Murray Pittock is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and a member of the European Academy and one of the world's leading Jacobite scholars. His book, Scotland, A Global History, is a must-read. It will blow your mind. Now, Chris Whatley is another Scottish historian with wide-ranging interests and a brain the size of a planet, who amongst other books gave us Scottish Society 1700 to 1830, Beyond Jacobitism Towards Industrialisation. I'm going to leave a link to these and other fine books by these gentlemen in the description below. A good way to start our exploration was the quotation that Chris gave us from another writer, the famous historical novelist Nigel Tranter.
That is a thought, is it not? A resident monarchy in Scotland, with all that implies. No Union Parliament in Westminster, so no need for self-government agitation. Scotland a potent force in Europe, almost certainly. There would have been no Highland clearances, of course, for the clan chiefs would not have lost their lands, and so the North would have probably remained more populous. No legacy of Victoria and of absentee lairdship. A Scottish Parliament typically would be quite the most squabblesome in existence, with the monarch presiding as in person as required, and there would be no Scottish National Party.
Ooh. Well, that's the view of Nigel Tranter from a Scottish perspective. But I asked our two experts to delve even deeper and to think on an international scale, and they came up with some pretty interesting thoughts. I started by asking if Culloden had to happen at all. Did it have to happen at all? Did Culloden have to happen?
Depends when. It certainly had to happen by mid-April 1746, because the last place that the Jacobites were guarding, the last borough that could hold their supplies, was Inverness. So they had to defend the road to Inverness.
And so, ultimately, if it didn't happen there, it would have happened somewhere in the area.
Yeah. There were two other sites. But
Murray listed the three possible sites that the Jacobites could have chosen, but the battle eventually took place where it did due to the fact that an overnight march to flank behind the Hanoverian forces had failed and the men had returned tired and disordered. If it was you, would you have chosen Culloden, or would you have gone with one of the other choices?
So the interesting issue is that it probably was a decent site, but it wasn't actually the site that was chosen the previous day. The previous day they were about a kilometre further towards Nairn, and the reason that they assembled rapidly in an area where the right hand side of the front line couldn't see the left was because most of the men after the failed night attack were sleeping in the grounds or round the grounds of Culloden House. So that actually because the front rank couldn't see the right couldn't see the left, that made it inferior to the previous site, which was actually up by more or less where what is called the Cumberland Stone is, and the mendacious supposition that the Duke of Cumberland hid a long way behind his third line, but in fact he didn't. He was
Yeah.
in a very exposed position because he was a brave man, whatever else he was.
Are there any scenarios in which the Jacobites could have won at Culloden?
I mean, it's better than 33-1, but I mean it's reasonable long odds.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a great expert in military history, but certainly what I understand is that, I mean, this is the last stand, so to speak, of an army which has been up and down Scotland and halfway down England, and is in a pretty poor condition in terms of physical health. And I think there's that, night beforehand, which is very, very difficult. So, notwithstanding the respective qualities of the generals, so to speak, or the commanders, the Jacobites were not in a good situation to fight that battle.
But remember that time that Liverpool came back in the second half of the European Cup final?
Yeah. I'm a Dundee United supporter. We never.
No, you had your day. You had your day.
I remember he was sitting in my room in Oxford watching Dundee United score in the last minutes against Barca in '87.
Those were
There you go. But our viewership of that.
So the odds for the Jacobites winning Culloden were roughly the odds for Dundee United winning at the Nou Camp. It has happened. It's only happened, but it's happened once.
Yes.
But that's all you needed at Culloden once.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, but let's get to, because that's essentially the question that we're asking today is, what if the Jacobites had won at Culloden? What were the implications both in the UK, in continental Europe, and in the world? At that time, we're talking about the middle of the 18th century. What would have happened if it had all been different?
I could have a shot at that. I think that would have been. I think the way I would see it is this: that Scotland and Britain, but Scotland in the 17th century, before the so-called Glorious Revolution, was in a state of war, civil war. And that carries on through into the 18th century, through to Culloden, and there's no doubt that Scotland was deeply divided. And that a victory of the Jacobites at Culloden or down in London after Derby and so forth, I think would have returned us to the 17th century in terms of the bitterness that would have prevailed.
Yeah. Were you not around in 2014?
I was around. And we can get back. We can connect.
No, let's not go there. Let's not go there.
We can connect all of that. But I think that the thing is that the way I see things, anyway, is that important principles have been established at the time of the so-called Glorious Revolution, and one of those principles was constitutional monarchy. And I think that is a huge factor in terms of the issue of the Jacobites versus the Hanoverians, and I think that would have been that there were not necessarily a majority. I think when Britain was divided, and I would concede that Murray has come along over the years with a lot of evidence to suggest the degree to which there was popular support for the Jacobites, but nevertheless there were elements very staunch, firmly believing Whigs or revolution men and women, if you like, in Scotland, who would have, I think, resisted had the Jacobites
won at Culloden. What would have happened immediately after, do you think?
Well, I think what I would say is you'd have to separate the two things. Winning at Culloden means they would have bought some time. The maximal position if they win at Culloden is that they managed to hold out in Scotland until the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle in 1748. That's basically it. So they hold out to the end of the War of the Austrian Succession, and then they get some concession, rather like the Irish got at Limerick in 1691, which is they get basically to go to serve with foreign powers, and then no reprisals. That's the maximal. But if the Jacobites win over the peace, as opposed to on the 16th of April 1746, then something very different happens. I think myself, I completely respect Chris's view. I think, however, that James and Charles are much closer to being the kind of monarchs, leaving aside religion in James's case. They're not in the end in Charles's case, because he converted to Anglicanism in St Mary Strand in 1750, who were available to the monarchical structures of 18th century Great Britain, which incidentally I think are probably more ancien regime than I think Chris thinks. That they were more old-fashioned, more elitist, more exclusionary than we're sometimes told. So I think the Civil War risk is not so great, but I agree that's a matter of interpretation. The key thing is that one of the things we can say about Jacobitism globally is, as an effect, is we would have had a degree of rapprochement with France, probably not as extensive as that of Charles II's, but a degree sufficient to have avoided the War of 1756-63, the 7 Years' War, and a division of the spoils between the French and British empires across the world. Had that war not happened, then there's almost no way in which the American colonies could have rebelled, because they would have a far more substantial French military presence in North America, which would put them at risk.
And was there motivation for rebellion, not the fact that they now had to pay for the costs of the 7 Years' War?
It certainly didn't help. And then, if that didn't happen, what also wouldn't have happened, and what especially talking about extra costs in 56-63, is the French government would have been much better able to deal with the agricultural crisis of the 1780s, and quite possibly averted the revolution of 1789. So the maximal situation is that there is no Napoleon. The Holy Roman Empire survives. The British and French empires divide the world. Remember,
this is fantasy after fantasy.
Oh, I love it though. You heard it here first, right? Murray Pittock. If the Jacobites had won, there would have been no French Revolution.
That is the maximal case.
I think there might have been a British Revolution had the Jacobites won, and all that. You see, well, where do we start? We're going to go back to basics here. I think Murray started by saying that he thought the Bonnie Prince Charlie, let's say, and his predecessors were different from the 17th century Stuarts. Now, I don't think there's bits of evidence which suggest, bits of evidence I've seen from Daniel Secchi and perhaps Murray himself to suggest that they were more inclined to go with the flow, so to speak. But the hard evidence is not that. The hard evidence is they were absolutists. The hard evidence is they were Roman Catholic, and I have that there's nothing wrong with Roman Catholic, but at the time that was an issue. At the time that was an issue.
Although,
and just if I can go on to the next point Murray's making about this British Empire joining with the French Empire, there is no way, in my opinion, or let me just take my opinion out of it. There is no way, according to many of the sermons I've read at the time in the aftermath of Culloden, that France was going to allow that Scotland or Britain equal standing. There was a fear, a concern amongst the anti-Jacobites, if you like, that we would become a colony, a province of France. That Louis XIV and his successors were never. France was in an ambitious, aggrandizing mode. Wanted to take over the world, basically. And they
unlike the British,
the British, the British did it for better or for worse.
Yes.
Worse. Sorry.
So I agree that it was a zero-sum game. I think the one thing that could have stopped it being a zero-sum game in the 18th century was the restoration of the Stuarts. Because one of France's long-term policy goals, and it remained their policy goal even after the French Revolution, when the Directory made a requisite move to support the Irish Rising of 1798, was to divide England, Scotland and Wales, the Stuart division of England, Scotland and Ireland, which would have been the domestic consequences of an overall Jacobite victory, the return to a composite monarchy with 3 separate courts and governments, would have been quite enough for France to have recognised a significant diminution in threat. And the Stuarts' connectivity with France and the importance of that connectivity, not just personally and dynastically, but also through the large numbers of those in exile in France and the huge role, let's face it, that French Jacobites played in the 7 Years' War, from Law's nephew, who was commander in India of the artillery in India against Clive, to the overall Irish command of the French campaign in India, through the importance of Jacobite officers in Canada in the French campaign. All of these people would not have been available to France, and moreover, they would have an interest as residents of France, if they didn't in fact go home, of a good relationship with France. The situation of the Treaty of Dover in 1670, which allowed Charles II to accept a substitute from Louis XIV, has not materially affected people's view of the last 15 years of Charles II's reign. Basically, Charles II is and was a pensioner of King Louis XIV. That is not what people think in British history today. And the Jacobite and Stuart Restoration would not have involved being a pensioner, because Great Britain was much more powerful than it was in 1670. And so we would just have a different view about the relationship between Great Britain and France, or the composite monarchy of the British Isles in France, as it developed in the later 18th century. I think some of these things you can take them too far. I'm saying it's the maximum. I'm not saying it'll all happen, but do I think the 7 Years' War wouldn't have happened? Yeah, I think that's a very safe bet. The 7 Years' War would not have happened with the Stuart Restoration. But let's remember something else. Let's remember the way in which British history excludes not just the Jacobites, but I just want to leave one very important factor of British history, which, had it remained, would have prevented German reunification. And that is that part of the monarchy of Great Britain until 1837, between 1714 and 1714, is Hanover. And I like anybody who's watching this to go and look at some British histories of the 18th century and see how often they mention Hanover as an integral part of the state. And the answer will be zero, or very close to zero. If Hanover had not, because of Salic law, Queen Victoria was not able to succeed in 1837, if Hanover had remained part of the British state, Bismarck's programme of German unification would have been impossible, because it would involve a clash between major powers on an enormous scale. So it be in no doubt that actually history as possibility, history that might have happened, is critical to changing the whole world as we know it. And that's as true about the Jacobites as it is of Hanover.
Now, the Culloden battlefield is just one of the places I'll be taking folks on my autumn tour of Scotland. Now, I don't know how many or if any places are still left by the time this goes out, but if you'd like the last places to join me in a visit to Culloden, as well as other battle sites, and Inverness, Mull, Iona, Loch Lomond and Loch Ness, wonderful historic places in Perth, St Andrews, Edinburgh and in between, then throw in one of my comedy shows and a Scottish Gaelic to finish, 11 days of hotel and dinner, bed and breakfast. Then click the link top right or in the description below, or email alexis@scotlandhistorytours.co.uk. I'll see you there.
Having said that, though, I mean, I listen to Murray and I have huge respect for Murray, but there's some very clever uses of words here. Would have.
Yeah, but that's what we're doing.
I think at the very least it could be could have.
Yeah.
Maybe. Yeah. If, but it didn't happen.
I'm not pretending it happened, but what I am saying is that the exclusion of Hanover from British history is an example of the way in which history serves the need of the memory of a society, not actually a proper account of what happens. And the true value of history is to try and give us a proper account of what happens. And British history is strung through with bad accounts of what happened because people want to remember it in a certain way.
Yes.
And the history, where we are in terms of Jacobite history, is as it is right now. But it wasn't always this. History is endlessly flexible, malleable.
And our perceptions of it change over time,
Yeah,
and with fashion as well,
exactly,
didn't it?
exactly.
So, but at least we've been able to have a wee dig into the possibilities. The whole world might have been different.
It might have been
Right?
different.
Do you know what I mean? You'd all be speaking French. For me, it's been a thrill to talk to Murray and Chris, and I hope it's inspired you to dig deeper. History turns on moments, and I hope that's given you a deeper insight into Scotland's history in the Jacobite period. But what if the Jacobites had never turned back at Derby to come to Culloden? How would things have been different then? There's a question that needs exploring. And it's a question that I did explore with Chris and Murray in the video that's coming up. You know you have to watch that. Just click the link coming up on screen now. These videos are only made with your help, so support the channel by clicking top right to become a Patreon member or buy me a coffee in the description below. Ha mé dóchas gún bí lá málaigh. Shéirí an drasta.